because it's thought that about 13,000 women were sent to Van Diemen's Land as convicts. Now, do you know where that is, Van Diemen's Land? That's the old name for Tasmania. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but you're standing in it. The old name for Tasmania. And about 8,000 of those women spent some time here, and you probably already know many of them had been sent for fairly minor and petty crimes. But in saying that, some of them had done some nastier stuff as well. Crimes involving violence. So they weren't all angels. But most had been sent for petty thievery, stealing to survive, because they were poor and hungry, and for that they were banished from family and friends for a minimum of 7 years. Now, regardless of what their crimes were, the authorities here viewed them all as sinners, which is a bit of an old word we don't use much these days, but I think you know what I mean. But as we go around, I'll be talking to you about the harsh treatment and conditions for the women while they were here. And I'm sorry, it's not a particularly happy story. Now, I do realise you're probably all on holiday, aren't you? You don't want to get too depressed on your holidays. So I do try to get a happier story in where I can, but on the whole it is pretty grim stuff. So you do need to prepare yourselves for that. And that's why, by the end of the tour, you may like to ask yourselves the question, maybe these women had actually been more sinned against than they themselves were sinners. So what we're going to do is head out over the road to the Hobart Rivulet, because that little stream plays a part to our story, and it's also a good place to see how big the female factory got at its largest extent. Now, you do need to mind the traffic as you're crossing over the road. It should all come from the mountain end, heading this way. But I suggest you have a sneaky look the other way as well.
Прикольно, прикольно произношение.
Вот да, вот именно старый, хороший, такой классический. Да,
Подмигурский трамвай.
Cross over straight over, and we're going to end up under those trees up there.
Чего? Да, березка. Березка, родная.
березка. Обнимашки.
Немножко.
You like that one?
Traditional Russian.
You know it
Yeah.
in your country.
Yeah.
Your name
Reminds
pretty
you of
Russian.
the old country.
Huh?
Reminds you of the old country. We call them
Yes.
silver birch.
Yeah.
Come over here away from the road a little. You have a lot of those there?
Yeah, a lot of.
Whole forests.
Yeah.
Yep.
Similar. Yeah.
Now, am I right in assuming that most of you are from the big island to the north of us? Yeah?
Yeah.
And a few people from overseas? No?
Yes and no.
Yeah?
From France but living in Melbourne.
Oh yeah, bienvenue.
Thank you.
In Tasmania we call little streams like this rivulets. This one, a Hobart rivulet, is why Hobart is put like that. Because this stream was the water supply for Hobart Town in the early years of European settlement. That becomes important later on, so remember that.
Does come from mountains?
Comes from the
Yeah,
mountain,
yeah,
our lovely Kunani.
Kunani.
But have a look down the
Welcome.
end of the street. Down on the corner on the left you can see a little cottage. That's where the female factory starts. Now we go right the way along this wall here. When it got to its largest extent, it didn't stop at the end of that wall where that minibus is, because 2 more yards were built going past the childcare centre and about 3 houses further down the road. You folks will have to gather in a little bit so you can see my picture here. Lovely. You can see that we've greyed out those last 2 yards because they're completely gone now.
Ну да, естественно.
And we're now standing outside yard 1.
Мгм.
This one here.
Ну, то есть
So
было еще.
the numbers of the yards relate to the order they were built in, because they weren't all built in one go. In fact, yard 1 was originally built as a distillery, a place for making gin and whiskey. Now, do you know what gin and whiskey is, young person? Gin and whiskey? That's right. It's all those bad, those drinks that are bad for children. They're also bad for the adults as well, but they ignore that. So that distillery was owned by a man named Thomas Lowes, and he thought he was going to make his fortune here on his land grant brewing up gin and whiskey. So that high stone wall you see was actually originally built to stop people getting in to flog the booze, rather than stopping people getting out. But we're going to put Thomas to one side for the time being. Now, moment. Back in those days, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur was the boss of the colony, and he was under quite a lot of pressure to deal with convict women in a way which would lead to their moral uplift and reform. Because even though they were seen as sinners by the authorities, they were going to be working as domestic servants in the big houses of the richer settlers and on their farms, so they had to be trusted there. But perhaps more importantly, Arthur also realised that many of them were likely to become the wives and mothers of the new colony of Van Diemen's Land. Because back in those days, there were around 10 men to every one woman, which is going to end in trouble, isn't it, buddy? I reckon there'd be trouble. Yeah. So Arthur started looking out for a building to turn into a female factory. And this is where Thomas, remember Thomas? Good, excellent, well done. He comes back into our story because he wasn't doing as well as he'd hoped with his distillery. And he offered up his buildings here to the government for sale for the purposes of being turned into a female factory, or more formally, a female house of correction. And Arthur quite liked that idea, because back in those days, none of these buildings or houses were here. So the site here was quite remote from Hobart town, out of sight, out of mind, away from the corrupting influence of some of the rough men down in Hobart. But also it had a nice source of fresh water running by. So Arthur obviously went ahead with that plan. The new female factory, just yard 1, was ready when early in 1829 the ship the Francis Charlotte arrived in the colony. It sailed directly from Mother England. And on board was 100 convict women and a few of their children as well. They got them all off the ship down in Sullivan's Cove around dawn. And they marched them under armed guard alongside this little stream here. And as they went through Hobart town, the local people looked down at them. So they could tell who they were. They knew where they were going. And there must have been some snobs amongst them, because they started calling that walk the Walk of Shame. All new arrivals of convict women in the colony did that walk from the harbour to here. What we're going to do is go inside yard 1. I'll start to show you bigger pictures of each of the yards to help you on your imagination journey, because we have started a time journey now. We started off with Thomas. We're going to move forward in time. By the end of the tour, you'll know what happened to all the buildings here, because I'm going to bring you right back to 2020, hey? 2020, which is probably where you want to be. So just mind the traffic as you're crossing over the road. Just be careful of the traffic.
Машину закинет, если только что.
looking.
They weren't looking. No.
Just follow.
Glad I did. Would have changed my day a bit. Alright. We're going to go into the room on the right there, folks. There we go. Bit dry. Up to the gym.
Но здесь у них был приемник-распределитель, где их принимали, описывали, переодевали в форму, ну и распределяли дальше по классам.
Now folks, gathering over here so you can all see my picture. Alright, so I'm going to be referring to this picture and stuff out here as well. You can see where we've come. We're in the bottom of this building here at the front. There were two-storey, fairly narrow buildings going right the way around the outside. See, there's one here. And a large building in the middle. And that's represented by those metal strips out there you see on the ground. Now where you see those benches out there, that represents a little chapel, a church, because religion was part of the reform program for the women. But the remainder of that building was taken up by communal bedrooms, dormitories for the women. So you need to try to imagine, in each one of those rooms, 20 to 25 women were locked away each evening. They were sleeping in 2 rows of hammocks. 10 rooms in all. This yard was built to house 200 convict women. But it was almost always overcrowded. Often there was 250 in here. And where you see those lines of rock, they represent these internal walls, which divided this space into a series of smaller yards, and each yard had its own name and purpose. This one was the hospital yard, because that section of the outer building was housing convict women who became ill or had fallen pregnant. But before I go on, I'm going to go back to that first group that arrived here. Remember I said there were some children in that group. Now, many people get a little surprised when they find out that some convict women were allowed to bring their children with them from the mother country, particularly if there was no father back there to look after them. But those women hadn't been told on the 12,000-mile sea journey on the ship. They only found out when they walked through that gate there that any child of theirs over the age of 3 years were taken away from their mothers, put into an institution on the other side of Hobart called the Queen's Orphan School. Now you don't need to worry, nobody's going to get taken away from their moms today, alright? This was a long time ago. They were doing that partly because these women were seen as sinners, hence bad mothers, but mainly because they'd been sent here to work as cheap labour to help build this new British colony down here in Van Diemen's Land, so the authorities didn't want them encumbered by having little children to look after, which, as you know, is a full-time job, eh? Now, you probably want to know, did they ever get those children back again? Don't you? Of course you do. But I'm going to leave you hanging a bit on that. I'll answer that question later on, I promise. Now, from here, the women were taken over when they first arrived to the hospital in small groups. If their own clothes were still in reasonably good condition from the journey, they would be bundled up for them and set aside for when they got assigned out from here to work for the free settlers. Because folks, this wasn't a prison. I know it kind of looks like one, eh? But the women weren't spending their 7, 10 or 14 years in here. Most convict women in the colony were out working. But while they were here, they were placed into one of 3 different classes, depending on the nature of the crime they'd been sent for and how well they behaved on the ship coming out. Now, which class you got placed into had a huge influence on your experience while you were here. I'll explain more of that as we go along. But what we are going to do shortly is head upstairs of this building. And that was the living quarters for the superintendent and matron, who were a husband and wife team who ran this place. Now for 19 years, the same couple lived up there. They were the Hutchinsons, John and Mary. And John was a Wesleyan Methodist minister, because Arthur favoured men of the church to run these sort of places, and he felt that Wesleyans, if you know anything about them, were made of the right stuff. Pretty stern, pretty strict. So what I'll get you to do is head up those stairs. I'll give you a little break from listening to me for a bit, because it's a bit of work, isn't it? But you're doing really well. So if you like to head up those stairs for me, that'd be great.
Только отбегала, вот эти вот каменные, это именно стены, которые были. Вот там была, где вот без скамейки, была церковь маленькая, а вот где металлические плоти, это были стены именно самих уже камер. То есть если они именно и содержались. Ничего. Встреча трафика. А вон для детишков люльки.
That's a little bit of a hint for everyone to come over here. You'd like to come over, folks, because I'm going to be referring to this plan. You only get a short break, because it's only a short tour. A mere 45 minutes. Okay, so there are those sleeping rooms, and the chapel, and the hospital. The yard below us down here was the nursery yard. So that section of the outer building was housing convict women looking after their own little babies, children of other convict women as well. And if any child manages to reach the age of 3 while they're here, what happens to them? Sent to the orphan school. The next yard was the kitchen yard. So that's where they were cooking up all the food for the women. But that leaves us with 3 remaining yards. One here, one in the far corner on the right, one in the other corner on the left there. Now those women who'd been sent for more minor crimes, had behaved on the ship coming over, were placed into first class, which was also known as the assignable class, because they were deemed to be trustworthy enough. They could be assigned out from here as soon as a position was found for them. So they may only spend a matter of a few weeks in here before they were assigned out. But while they were here, this was their sleeping rooms and they were given the lightest work to do. Because you might have wondered about the name Female Factory. It's a strange sort of name, isn't it, you'd have to say. Well, it comes down to the fact that all the women were put to some form of work while they were here. First class convict women were doing the lightest, needlework, carding and spinning wool, perhaps helping in the hospital if they had some nursing experience. But those who'd been sent for more serious crimes, particularly crimes involving violence, were placed down in crime class, where they had to do the hardest labour of washing work all day long. Now, who likes washing? None of you. Well, that's good, because these women were doing the hard work of washing heavy woolen blankets, bedding and uniforms of government institutions and off the transport ships all day long. Imagine that. But if they did their work well and behaved, they could move up from crime class into probation class. Continue to behave, could move up into first class. And then you had a chance to see the rest of the world out there. But crime class was also for women who did something wrong while they were out working. They were sent back here. And the most common thing they did wrong out there was to simply run away from their masters, what was called absconding, because it has to be said that some of those blokes were not particularly nice to them. Or it may have been simply a matter that she knew there was a party happening on the farm next door, and there was a man there she'd like to spend some time with, if you know what I mean. You do.
Грязно приставали, многие смотрели.
Do you all know what I mean? Oh, good. I got to check in sometimes, you know, to make sure you're with me. Now, but if as a result of that more pleasant time with him, or the master having his wicked way with her, she fell pregnant, she'd also be sent back here, into the hospital to have a baby. And then she'd move over and join the other nursing mums and bubs in the nursery. She could only stay with her baby until it was 6 months old. And then it would be weaned, left in the care of other convict women, while she had to go down into crime class to do a punishment for the crime of falling pregnant. Pretty rough, eh? So we'll head on down now. We might come into the chapel, folks, so you can have a little seat.
Жизнь была суровая. Да, там даже, скажем, они иногда владельцу надоедали, и он просто писал, говорит, заберите что-то, она, говорит, косо на меня смотрит. И за это тоже можно было загреметь. Отказала, загремела. Да. Жизнь женщин тех времен, особенно заключенных, это был полный ахтунг. А, ну да, официально с лица. Алла, Якпар.
Мы молимся, братья и сестры.
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
After
It's like
yesterday.
school, isn't it? Remember school?
Oh, it was too long ago.
It's too long ago.
Still, of course, still remember.
No, you're a young man.
Something. Yeah.
Found your posse? Found the groups together? Lovely.
Well looked after.
So by now you're getting a bit of an idea of how grim this place was, aren't you? Imagine it in the deep winter. With all those walls blocking out whatever sun there was. It wasn't a great place for people. But also, such a good place for getting the washing dry. So here we have a picture of yard 2.
Laundry.
It was built on the other side of that wall, that's absolutely correct. And with this yard they could relieve some of the overcrowding in here by putting most of the crime class women in a separate yard. But instead of having communal bedrooms, these buildings here had individual sleeping cells for the women. They looked like this. Pretty grim looking. They were called light working cells. Because you'll notice above each doorway was an opening. that allowed enough light inside those cells for the women to be able to work in there. Normally they just sleep in there overnight. In the daytime, come out and do the washing. But if they'd upset a guard, he might leave her inside her light working cell and give her a job called picking oakum, which involves a piece of rope from a ship. And I happen to have one here in my bag, which is handy. Looks a bit frightening, you know, scary looking, but it's only a bit of rope. It comes covered in tar. Originally, this is how it comes. Have a poke with that tar. Pretty hard, hey? Give it a poke with your fingernails. Oh, they're interesting nails. No way, I won't comment on anything else. Give it a good pop. The job of picking oakum involved picking that tar off, but they had to do it just with their fingernails. Why were they doing that? Well, they were getting it down to this raw hempen fibre. In the end part, I have some in my pocket here which I prepared for you earlier today. That was a joke. Thank you. And that was used to stuff into mattresses to make bedding, but also as caulking for shipbuilding. It was rammed between the timbers of ships to seal them and tar back over. So that was the job. They were recycling old rope into something useful. And this place was getting paid for that. Not the women, of course. But I'd like you to imagine yourselves, you fiery Irish lasses. Can you do that? And you've been working away at that for a while, your fingers were sore. So you decided to tell the guard, well, I can shove his oakum where the sun doesn't shine. I won't do it. But do you reckon it's a good idea to talk to a guard like that?
Yeah.
He might well say, all right, lass, it's the dark cell for you now.
Бац, и карцер. Яйца, вот такой вот карцер.
Ты вообще в желе считала, если бы крыши нормально не было, то это жара или холод.
Ну это все было каменное, это не было не
So folks, this was the grimmest corner of all. These were the only windows in this part of the building. They allowed enough light down these corridors for the guards. On either side was a row of cells, the size of where you see the gravel here. But the difference with these cells is once they closed the door on them, it was pitch black inside. Now who's been to Port Arthur? Did you go into the dark cell there?
Yeah.
You'll understand what dark is, hey? It was pitch black. So part of the punishment for a woman put in the dark cell was having nothing to do but just to sit in the dark and wait for their one meal a day, a chunk of bread. At the front were two buckets, one for their fresh water and the other bucket I'll leave up to your own imagination what that was for. But we have made a bit of a mock-up of one of these cells, but it's not all that effective because it's not dark when we close the door. What would you like to have a go? How do you reckon she'll go? For 3 days. 3 days we'll give her, eh?
3 days,
How are you
4
going
days.
now, 3 days later? Bit stuffy. Yeah, we could make it 7 days. We better not, hey? We better let her out, don't you think? Yeah. All right. We've got to keep moving along, but on the way to the next yard, we're going to stop in one of the dormitories because I've got a bit of a happier story for you now. All right? You're probably ready for one, are you? Who wants a happy story?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right, I'll meet you over in first class dormitory.
Я сказал, с драматургом. платан.
Let's get them all in first, hey, come inside, don't stay out there. I won't put you in another cell, don't worry. Because once we get locked away in our dormitory, this is a time when we like to have a little bit of fun. We make a bit of space for some singing, maybe a bit of dancing. Open the old Mr. Hutchinson, remember him? Yeah. Hope he's got his fingers in his ears. He doesn't like the rude words we use in our songs. You might also do a bit of dealing. You managed to get some in. You haven't walked through the gate with it because you're going to get caught. So you make an arrangement with a friend outside. If you ever get sent back here, just toss a packet of tobacco over the wall for you. And you'll hope that the guard didn't see you pop it in your pocket. Get back into the dormitory, do some dealing. You mean? Did you want some tobacco?
Yep, yep, thanks.
Oh, you don't smoke? Oh, I'm glad. It's bad for you to smoke, isn't it? Bad. But you know, those 8,000 women that spent time in here, many of them were lucky enough to get assigned out to a good man, a fair master. They behaved themselves and they never had to come back here ever again for the entire rest of their sentence. And down the road, some nice fellow might have asked to marry them. And they could marry, even as a convict, if they had permission. Now, if that was granted, that could be the start of what I call happy days for her, because then she could ask to get a child back from the orphan school. You're supposed to all go, oh, there, at that point. Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. She could settle down, maybe even get a little farm together with a husband and lead a good and happy life for the rest of her convict period. Oh, thank you, sir. I love it. But other women went through this place over and over again. And it may seem strange to you. Some deliberately did something wrong out there so that she would be sent back here. Maybe she didn't want to be a domestic servant to some toff out there, or maybe she wanted to have a chance to see a child again before it was sent to the orphan school, or perhaps simply she was missing her friends. And here at least she knew that she could occasionally enjoy herself, and she could work the system as well. But after a while, the authorities realised inside these dormitories a bit of a subculture had formed. And in their minds, some of the women were having too good a time and teaching bad habits to the newcomers. And they didn't like that. So when they added on the next yard, yard 3, they'd invented something called separate treatment. We'll go and have a look.
Вот это жесть. Как в Порт-Артуре. Да. Мне кажется, здесь продают сразу эту колоду.
Not too much Australian slang for you? No? You understand strong?
You sound like you know the old audio books.
Sorry?
When the people reading audiobooks,
Yeah,
like it's your voices and yes, your
That's what I do,
intonations,
yeah.
it's just amazing.
Story. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
storytelling.
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So things were really cranking up now in Van Diemen's Land. On our time journey, we're up to the early 1840s. In 1840, they stopped sending convicts to New South Wales. So now they were sending a lot more to Van Diemen's Land, so they added on this yard here. Now these buildings also had individual cells, but the authorities didn't call them cells. You know what they called them? Separate apartments. Which sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? But the idea now is to keep the women separate from each other, stop those bad habits from spreading, but also to give them plenty of time to quietly reflect on their lives. Because the women were spending almost all their time now inside their separate apartment, quietly working away at their jobs by themselves. But that wasn't meant to be punishment, like those dark cells. In the minds of the authorities, this was now the best way to reform convict women, by giving them plenty of time to reflect and make their own conclusion. The best thing to do is to knuckle down and get through as smoothly as possible, have some happy days at the end of their convict journey. Now we've made a bit of an excavation over here, folks. So you can see the foundation for 3 of these separate apartments. What do you think? Palatial? No. So those spaces were their bedrooms, their working rooms, their living rooms and their bathrooms. So can you guess what this tunnel here was for?
Sewerage?
Very good. They used water off the building to flush human waste where? Down into the rivulet for those nice folk down in Hobart. There were all sorts of unsavoury things happening along that stream out there. And by the 1820s down in Hobart town, it really was a scene. Now it wasn't that bad this far upstream, but it wasn't a scene today. Imagine what was happening here. They were getting sick, weren't they? From dysentery. Other diseases. Worst of all, they've been taken away from their mums. At 6 months. Think about that, that's not going to end well, is it? And 2 out of 5 of those children will never make it outside these walls. But you know, there were some nice people living in Hobart at the time. And when they found out about that, there was a public outcry. And this place got into a bit of trouble. So, after 10 years, they took the nursery out of Yard 1, put it into other buildings around Hobart town. But then, in 1850, that's when they added on the next Yard 4, and built a brand new nursery to try to improve conditions for the infants. Let's go see if it works.
Yeah. Yeah, they used the wall as the back wall of the building, as they did here.
So we're up to 1850 now, folks, and this was the single matron's quarters here behind you. She no longer had to be the wife of the superintendent. He got a nice house for himself over where that shed is there. But she had to be on site here to keep an eye on the new nursery, which was built right the way along this wall here. And we're going to finish off the tour inside the nursery. So you can see from my picture, the new nursery was quite a grand building with some quite nice features. Better heating, bigger windows, bigger rooms, nice veranda along the front. And the women now were allowed to keep their babies until they were 9 months old. But you reckon that extra 3 months would have helped all that much, folks? Hard to say, isn't it? But at least we get to say that the authorities were trying their best. But we have a quote from an official who visited this nursery when there were 60 women in here, many babies, from 2 days to 2 years of age. But the whole time he was here, they were all completely silent, both the women and the children. Now the women had probably been told to be quiet. But 60 babies under the age of 2 all silent, that's not natural, is it? So what conclusion can we make? They were so weak from disease, malnutrition, depression. They didn't have the strength or the will to cry. And that's the saddest story of all. That's why I warn people at the start of this tour. I can't sugarcoat it. But we're going to move forward now to 1853. I'm going to skip that last yard because I've been going on a bit, haven't I? I'm going to go forward now to 1853 because that was the year they stopped sending convicts to Van Diemen's Land. And numbers of convict women dropped steadily. By 1856 there was no longer a need for a female factory and they closed it down. Now that was a special year here, 1856. It was the year they changed the name from Van Diemen's Land to
Tasmania.
Which was the start of what I call the Great Forgetting. Because Tasmania wanted to look forward to a bright new future as a free society and sweep all their convict past under the carpet as a shameful period of history. Now when they closed the female factory down, they used the buildings here for other institutional purposes. And you're standing in this long building at the front of that picture taken in 1900, and the matron's quarters is that one in the corner there. The buildings were used for as infectious diseases hospital, maternity ward for poor women, a boys' reformatory, but mostly to house invalids. People who were doing it rough and didn't have families to look after them. Out there they brought them here to end their days. The poor old folks. And of course many of those people were ex-convicts. Those ones who'd never found their happy days. So we'd have to say that they were more sinned against than sinners. But you know, even though there were plenty of victims to the system of transportation, in some ways it kind of worked. Because many convicts did get through and out the other side. Convict women, many of them ended up marrying a nice fella, settling down, having a big family, and they ended up leading a reasonably good life here in Tasmania, possibly better lives than they would have spent if they had stayed back in Ireland where they might have starved to death, or in the slums of London where they would have had to keep stealing just to survive. Here in Tasmania they could hope to own a bit of land. And the sun shines more here in Tasmania than it does back in Ireland. But while they were convicts, they also succeeded in building this colony, literally. And the convict women founded a new population. We know that because today, estimates vary, but you're on pretty safe ground to say that 1 out of 3 native-born Tasmanians can trace their family trees back to convicts. But back in 1900, when that photo was taken, that was not something you talked about in public. It was still a shameful thing then to be descended from a convict. So when the government decided to sell this whole complex off in 1905, they'd finished with it. They'd auctioned off each of the yards, and the businesses aboard the yards didn't want the buildings. They didn't suit their purpose. And unfortunately nobody thought about Airbnb back in those days. Otherwise we'd be making a mozza today, wouldn't we? Yeah, I reckon. And nobody cared too much at the time when those businesses just started knocking those buildings down to sell off the bricks and the stone. That one behind you survived, the matron's quarters, only because the people who bought this yard turned that into their private house. And they added on those front rooms, and that building was lived in as a private residence right up to 2003.
Almost kind of.
So we've come almost full circle, haven't we, folks? But just to tie it up into a nice neat bow, by the 1970s, Tasmania had now grown up enough to be prepared to take the convict past out from underneath the carpet and dust it off and have a good one. Because in 1976, the government bought Yard 1 back for a historic site. In 99, they built the next one where the visitor centre is, and finally this one in 2003. Now, after we got World Heritage status for the site, this mob took over the management. And we're the ones who put up those gabion walls to represent where the old ones were, and these features here to represent the buildings, interpretation panels like that one there. And they gave people like me a job, talking to people like you. And that brings me right back to 2020, doesn't it? That's the end of my tour.
Thank you.
You've been a lovely attentive audience, and I do appreciate that greatly, especially you smaller people. Thanks for that. Thanks for hanging in. Good on you. 45 minutes is a long time to listen to somebody, isn't it? But you've done well. Now, those that are doing the her story, you just need to be back at the centre a couple of minutes before 12. If you've not already done so, you can have a look inside the cottage or go back to the other parts of the yards, have another look. But otherwise, thanks for dropping by.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton. Yeah, I just have a quick one.
Yeah.
Is the original
That is the
bricks
original.
or restored?
Where some of them, see, we put that new one in.
Yeah, because it looks like a
But the
brand new
wall itself is the original wall.
original.
These ones, you see that, even they knocked the walls down after a while, eventually. Even here, they've already knocked some of the back ones down.
Oh, it was so big waterfall.
No, that was like a quarry with a stone.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it's a
Yeah,
waterfall.
it sort of looks like a waterfall, doesn't
Yeah.
it? But no, it's a cutting in where they took the road across there.
And yeah, here's the channel.
That's the little creek out here.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's me driving horse and cart. The horses died
All
since
right.
that photo.
Okay.
Taken, poor fella.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
It was a
well
pleasure
done.
to see you.
Yeah? Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Ленчик.